The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
I was in Manawatu recently, so beautiful.
Fielding is New Zealand's most beautiful town 34 years in a row.
Really?
Most beautiful?
Stunning.
I don't know who runs the competition. I think they were the victims of New Zealand's first Nigerian fax scam in the early 80s.
Yeah.
Wow. Just enclose a postal order for $1,000 with your application for New Zealand's most beautiful town, and oh my God, we won, and 34 years later, they're still supporting some village.
All right. Should we start the podcast?
Very well.
Tēnā koutou katoa. This has gone by lunchtime on Wednesday the 2nd of July. I'm Toby Manhire. Kia ora, Annabelle Mather.
Kia ora, Toby Manhire.
Kia ora, Ben Thomas.
Morena.
And Te Ai Butler with us as ever. Start with Takutai Tarsh Kemp, the Pati Māori MP for Tāmaki Makaurau since 2023. She died suddenly last week, as you'll know. A real shock for everyone, and a huge loss for her whānau, for her Te Pāti Māori colleagues, for Parliament more generally. Just a few days, Annabelle, after her 50th birthday, and she was diagnosed last year with kidney disease and had some months off, but had been back in Parliament. Was there, I think, right up to
literally the day, the day,
Yeah, and active and about. And there was some really moving tributes in Parliament last week, and then the tangi this week at Opaia Marae at Taihape. And I mean, God, what a lot she packed into those 50 years. Hip hop. Hip Hop International New Zealand Director. She's Chief Executive of Manurewa Marae, and then Member of Parliament when she, there was that incredibly close race with Penny Henare, who I think he came second by 42 votes in the end after a recount. But it was a very spiky campaign. And yet he's spoken really movingly about her as his sister, and it's a real affecting moment when you get that kind of look into the human reality of. I think Shane Jones spoke quite well on that, in Parliament, for all the adversarial, antagonistic bows, arrows that are fired across the House. There is a human side to it all. Moe mai rā.
Yeah, she's such a lovely person. I went to uni with Tash, and just over the last few days I have this enduring memory of, her being hapu with her first child, and, as a uni student, and how excited she was about it. And, as you've already mentioned, she's a staunch advocate and supporter of rangatahi. During the election, she came into Mata to do an interview, and I was surprised by how nervous she was, because she was such a great talker and communicator and so at ease with people, but I think she wasn't really someone who was used to the limelight. She was someone who, did all the mahi behind the scenes, and I feel like she was just starting to find her stride in Parliament, and seeing her at work in the select committee and the select committees and all of that sort of stuff. So it's such a tragedy, because I feel like she was going to become a real force in Parliament, and already has been a force in Te Ao Māori in her own quiet way. But such a loss, and such a important reminder that the whanaungatanga amongst across the House with all MPs, but particularly in Te Ao Māori, like, yes, her and Penny went up against her, but she's a close relation to Penny's partner Sky, a close whanaunga to Tama Pōtaka. All of those hononga endure, and I think, as Willie Jackson's already said over the last week, like, that Māori MPs can debate each other fiercely and passionately, but at the end of the day, that whanaungatanga always endures.
Ben?
Yeah, not an MP that I ever had anything to do with, but just, obviously extremely sad when somebody, first of all, dies in office, but also, at such a young age. Just aroha to her colleagues and family.
It made me think about, like with Efeso dying last year, and obviously Parikura back in, was it 2012, I think Parikura passed, or 2011. Like these Māori and Pacifica representatives who pass away while serving in Parliament, it's an important reminder of the health inequalities that Māori experience, and just because you're an MP or have a high profile, that doesn't make you immune to those challenges. And the fact that she worked right up until the very end, in spite of being so incredibly sick, really speaks to her commitment to serving our people. And when I think about Tarsh and how she'll be remembered, I think that she'll be remembered as a wahine who, instead of scooping kids up and sending them off to boot camps, she scooped them up and she put them onto stages so they could dance all around the world. And during COVID, instead of, inciting fear and resentment, she vaccinated 65,000 people. What a legacy. The amount of lives and livelihoods that she saved is, I think, incredible. But mostly, and most importantly, I think for her whānau, she will be remembered as a tupuna to be proud of. And I think that's a wonderful thing to be able to leave to your uri, your descendants.
There will, of course, be a by-election in Tāmaki Makaurau, but quite appropriately, everyone involved has decided to put that to one side until Takutai Tarsh Kemp is put to rest. And I think next week, or in the coming days, Christopher Luxon will announce a by-election date. We don't know yet. Christopher Hipkins said this morning that the Labour caucus hasn't even talked about who or if they'll stand in that seat. So but that will be something that we'll talk about in the weeks to come. We wanted to sort of zoom right out and have a look at the results of a survey that is done periodically, I think quarterly, by Ipsos. It's called the Ipsos Issues Monitor. You've probably come across it from time to time, but it's a different kind of approach to polling in that the clue's in the name, Issues Monitor. It polls people on a number of things. The top line is ask people to nominate from a list the three issues that are their main issues of concern, and then it also asks people which parties they think are best equipped to deal with those issues. And you might have seen it sort of presents in a board with a bit like a departure board at an airport, but you've got the different party logos and then the issues. And one of the things that has for some years now, I think for about the last 3 years, cost of living has been at the top of that pile. And it had started to recede a bit in terms of the numbers, if not the position. And that was, in a way, a kind of measure of, from the perspective of the government, a corner being turned in the wider economy, which also ranks highly. But in the last results, which came out early last week, it actually increased cost of living by, I think, 4 points. And Labour were judged very slightly, but for the first time in a long time, as the better equipped to deal with cost of living as an issue. That's what sort of sticks out to me as the top line out of it. Ben, do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it shows a trend that I think also shows up in terms of the economy as an issue. So the economy is distinct from cost of living.
Where National is slightly ahead on, interestingly. Yeah.
Isn't that weird, that people...
Yeah, and it comes down to how they what they do is they ask people, what are your top 3 issues? And then the pollsters themselves kind of group it into things. So economy could be certain other answers, or it could just be people saying, oh, I'm worried about the economy, or, and so it's a little hard to pass that. But what it seemed to be showing was that for the last couple of surveys, sort of going back to sort of midway, then late last year, cost of living has been declining, as one of, as a percentage of anyone's top 3 issues. Is still way ahead for a while, for a long time, but it's still, very dominant. But it had declined, like you said. Economy has been coming up in comparison, so that suggests people are, they're not so much, they weren't, they were getting less worried about, say, their grocery bills and their bills, but they were becoming more worried about, am I going to lose my job? Can I find a job if I'm looking for one? Should I start a business? Things like that. And, can I get a pay rise, I guess? Things like that. And what we've seen both with cost of living and the economy is as time has gone by with this government, National has been seen as less capable of handling those two things. So they started off with pretty strong leads on both, and now, Labour have just overtaken National in terms of perception of, who is the party better equipped to deal with this or more capable of managing it. And then in terms of economic management as well, National has been declining, although it's still reasonably ahead of Labour. And this is a sort of risk that comes up with political parties, which is, and we saw this with the Freshwater poll that the Post did as well, when you identify yourself with an issue, you own it, and that means that you get the bad news as well as the good news. And so, the government has been talking about cost of living, obviously, since its time in opposition. So it's very identified with that. And people are sort of, people tend to more blame the current government for it. And then also with the economy, that's been the mantra of the government this year: economic growth, year of growth, going for growth agenda. Everything's directed towards economic growth. If people don't feel it's happening, then they start to blame the government for it. They say, well, this was your big thing. You're carrying the ball, and you're carrying the ball, and you got splayed out unconscious in the game of run it straight with international economic forces and the domestic economy. And you would expect that that's having an impact on National's polling, which continues to be pretty weak, sort of tending to be in the sort of low 30s now.
We've said it before, but there is an echo of when Labour declared, whichever year it was, the year of delivery, and then that was very much a rod for their own back. The year is not done yet, and there is room for more growth, but this is the year of growth, and very in full declamatory style that was presented at the year's outset. And it's no use saying, oh yeah, but there were lots of global headwinds, tum-to-tum, that's really attached to the mast is the big deal. What are you seeing in this, Annabelle?
The thing that stood out for me and that I've made me feel sad, to be honest, was that unemployment is the 5th most important issue to people aged between 18 and 34, because that is the most basic fundamental building block of of being able to support oneself, right? And so, I think that's a pretty damning finding, I think, in terms of how this government is tracking. I find it confusing that people, on one hand think that Labour is best to deal with inflation, cost of living, housing, house prices, poverty, inequality, rada, and yet they think National is best to deal with the economy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there,
What does that mean? Like National's better at going on trips overseas to talk to like foreign dignitaries? I don't know. It's weird. But I think if you were Labour, you would read this and think, cool, okay, all I have to do is sit quietly. This is National's election to lose rather than ours to win. But I still think that would be a mistake, and that they need to start floating some aspirational ideas that young people can get behind, and sticking to the simple issues like, we've just seen the Democratic primary for the mayoralty of New York. The candidate, Zohran Mamdani, just electrified voters over there talking about the real simple things, cost of housing, groceries, childcare, and I think that there's lessons to be learnt there for the left.
I mean, the in terms of which party is best equipped to deal with these issues, the quantums are relatively low. They're in the like Labour is favoured by 32% versus 31% for National. So it's, when we see the number flick from, with the card flick from National best to Labour best, there's still no, it's not an overwhelming vote of confidence in Labour. And I think you're totally right to run. I mean, if you think back to the Australian election of, would it have been 2022 when Labour played that small target strategy? They basically tried to keep their head down, not announce too much, and work on the basis that people disliked the incumbents. What do you think, Ben? I agree with Annabelle that would be the mistake on the part of Labour, and probably unviable anyway, given they've got later this year, as promised, the big tax announcements to make.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing the limits of the small target strategy in the UK now, where that was certainly what Keir Starmer ran with. We're seeing continued weakness from our bigger parties over here, Labour and National. If you were Labour, you would probably be hoping to come into government on something a little higher than sort of 34% of the vote. That leaves you really at the mercy of your much less popular, much more controversial coalition partners. And also it means that there is inevitable disappointment when you do things that you haven't really flagged, which the Starmer government seems to be doing now. And I don't know what they're polling, about 19% now,
Shocking,
18%, something like that. So, yeah, I think that's a mistake. I think you do want to flag what you're going to do. Spend a bit of time socialising your deeply unpopular capital gains tax policy, so that it's hopefully inoculated from their point of view before the election campaign begins. The other issue I think that is, where they would see vulnerability is health. So obviously there's a change up in health minister, very unusual to do that after only 1 year in government, particularly somebody who had been the health spokesperson and had as much expertise in the area as Dr. Retty. But it had developed into a real political issue for the government ever since the last budget. And what we're seeing is that in Ipsos, and I think the Freshwater poll, it's continuing to increase as an issue of concern. Now, one wrinkle in the Ipsos poll was that in terms of the breakdown of age groups, it actually became, it previously had been the number one issue for 50 plus, 50 to 64-year-olds and 65 plus for some time. And it dropped down to second after cost of living for 50 to 64-year-olds, but absolutely skyrocketed to an even greater level among 65 pluses. So those older, who tend to skew conservative, tend to skew centre-right voters, seem to be really, really worried about health right now. And that's going to be of concern to the government. Simeon Brown's been extremely busy.
Yes.
Huge number of I mean, Tony Ryle Theory have put out 1 to 2 press releases every day, just, bury the press in announcements about health, but including, some really substantive announcements, GP funding most recently. Well, today, big boost to elective surgeries.
Second round of that announced this morning,
Yeah, but they're not seeing the polling, the polling on health move, because people are still sort of, waiting 3 weeks to see a GP in some centres. And long waits in ED. And now one very promising sign is that childhood vaccinations are up again as a result of working towards those government targets, which I think shows the value of setting targets for health. They're introducing amendment legislation to the Paiora Act,
and working with Māori health providers helps.
Yeah, well, that's right, and actually an interesting announcement in that when they announced that amendment legislation to the overarching legislative framework which set up Health NZ and those things, they're going to be changing the remit of the iwi Māori partnership boards again. Those were sort of a bit of a blank slate under the original legislation, but the idea was that they would sort of feed up into the National Māori Health Strategy with the now defunct Māori Health Authority. Dr. Reti was sort of retooling them towards more being kind of local commissioning, having local commissioning powers themselves to sort of set up their own health services. That seems to have gone by the wayside as well. It appears that they will now just be sort of reinvented again as just sort of, kind of advisory, giving local feedback, I would say diminished in scope and stature once again. But yeah, so I think health is one of those things where the reality's on the ground. It takes a long time to, as they say, turn the ship around, or to, for a physician to heal himself. And so I think that'll be something for Labour, that Labour will be looking at pretty hard in the next year.
And I think the challenge that Simeon Brown has is that you can do your number crunching and you can come out with a whole lot of stats about how waiting lists have reduced or whatever. But this is an area where anecdata will trump that, because so many people are having terrible experiences in the health system, or their cases are being reported as reduced waiting lists, when in fact what's happened is someone else has reviewed their case and decided that they don't need the operation that they need, and therefore the waiting list reduced by that one person, but that one person, tells all their friends and whānau and colleagues and whatever. And so while you might be able to present some numbers that say things are getting better, when people are actually experiencing things getting worse, the concern for the public does not dissipate, and that's what we're seeing in these
and notwithstanding
polls.
Ben being quite right that it takes time for any changes to filter through to the coalface. Absolutely, you're right. There is not a family in New Zealand that hasn't had an interaction in some form or other with the health system, and that includes, by the way, the mental health services, which have many challenges of their own. So, there's no getting around the kind of, in terms of assessing the state of things. To underscore that point, back on the Ipsos survey, if you look at it's number 2 issue after cost of living / inflation, and if you wind back to 2023, in early 2024, it was being nominated by, in the low 30s, 31, 32% of people named it as one of their 3 main issues of concern. That now, over the last year, it's in the 40s, currently up to 43%. And on the party line, 40% of people think Labour the best to deal with it, versus 24% for National. That's slightly stabilised for National, which might be some encouragement for Simeon Brown, but that just sort of puts the numbers, attaches the numbers to the point that Ben's making. All right, let's talk briefly, shall we, about Ngāpuhi, New Zealand's biggest iwi.
One of my faves.
Is it one of your faves? Have you?
I like them a lot.
Would you do a ranking of the iwi
I made
for
3
us
of them.
for New
I
Zealand?
made 3 Ngāpuhi, so there you go.
You've made 3 Ngāpuhi.
Yes.
Okay. Well
2
done.
girls and a boy. You're welcome.
Would you write a ranking of the iwi of Aotearoa for us?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Not
Well,
except to say that Ngai
commissioned.
Tahu are number 1.
Yeah, obviously.
Followed closely by Ngāti Kahungunu, obviously.
Well, maybe we'll touch on both of those in this conversation. Shane Jones, aforementioned, a man of the North, former activist, in recent days has proposed a members' bill, which he intends to table, which would oblige Ngāpuhi to undertake a settlement as a single commercial entity versus what many of the approaches, perhaps in your old colleague Chris Finlayson's time, Ben, I think maybe looking at different options, including because there are lots of differences between the hapu of Ngāpuhi. Many, as David Seymour has pointed out, don't consider Ngāpuhi to be the same corporate entity, but in fact a collection of hapu. Shane Jones said, "There's only one economic settlement for the Ngāpuhi tribe. Now, I realise this will jar for many of the hapu leaders, but this is the time for the big fish, not the sprats." How's that going to go down, Annabelle?
Hasn't gone down well.
Has it not?
Surprisingly. Ngāpuhi have not received this well. I think there's a couple of issues at play. Firstly, there hasn't been any consultation with the runanga about it, the big fish that he speaks of. Secondly, Ngāpuhi have been working constructively with the Crown for a very long time. They're all sorted. They're basically all on board with each other about what they want. There's finer details that are being worked out, amongst the hapu themselves. But they've been waiting patiently while governments come and governments go and policy comes and policy goes. And they are very clear about what they want, and forcing them is not going to speed up the process. I think the other thing too, that reason why people are a bit shocked by it, is that Shane has no mandate. Shane is not the MP for Te Tai Tokero or even Whangarei or anywhere. And so for a party to come out that has no mandate in the North, that has not consulted with the hapu, the iwi or the runanga, I think just took them all by surprise.
And it is, Ngāti Kahungunu settled a couple of years ago, I think, and that's the strip up the west, the bottom half of the North Island, east. Sorry, big stripe.
Yeah, big streak.
Of whenua, and they did it in a hapu by hapu settlement, right?
I mean, if we're talking about
not quite hapu by hapu.
They had a range of different settlements, but if we are talking about hapu settlements that relate to the North, then there is an excellent example. We can talk about Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, which is a hapu based in Auckland, part of a wider iwi that includes Te Roroa, Te Tau'u, others. So there's already a precedent set for hapu getting settlements. But what we need to remember is that these hapu are huge. These are almost iwi within their own right, and it's not a hapu by hapu settlement that they're proposing. They're proposing 6 regions within the North, like a breakup of 6. So it's not like you're going around to 100 different hapu shelling out money.
Yeah, the Ngāpuhi settlement, such as it is, has, I remember being a press secretary for Chris Finlayson, and maybe it was about 2010, and a journalist called up and said, "I understand something's happening with Ngāpuhi," and I said in my coyest sort of tone, "Look, just on background, obviously I can't give you any details, but I think there's been a breakthrough, and we're going to be signing pretty soon." And then, a couple of years later, I looked back and, realized my sort of folly there. The government at that point was sort of backing Te Horonuku, which was a vehicle set up by the Runanga of Ngāpuhi, which was basically it was basically an organisation kind of that was the custodian of the fisheries settlement money, and they had done the work of trying to get a mandate. So before the Crown will begin negotiations with any group on behalf of an iwi or a hapu or what's called a large natural grouping for the Crown for a treaty settlement, they have sort of steps to show that there's some sort of mandate secured. Now, Ngāpuhi at the time was, I think, probably about 115,000 members. Now it's, I don't know how.
200,000.
Thanks to Annabelle and people like her. I don't know what it is now. It's like the contingent liability on the Crown grows every day. But and of course, just like any iwi, most of them don't live in the north anymore. Probably Sydney and Brisbane are two of the major centres for Ngāpuhi around the world. And so getting that mandate, or trying to demonstrate that you have sort of broad approval to negotiate and represent, not just sort of any kind of statistically significant proportion of Ngāpuhi, but also, balanced across the different regions, is, by which I mean the sort of traditional rohe up north, impossible. It's very, very hard. And the Crown probably supported that for far too long, and tried to kind of, try to negotiate to try and get a kind of compromise agreement with Te Kotahitanga, which was a group of sort of hapu who didn't agree with that, and Ngāti Hine, who were a really key part of that, are still one of the sort of major groups involved. And so look, the Crown, I think, has been sort of wedded to this idea of a single Ngāpuhi settlement, and I think it dates back to the genesis of treaty settlements in general, which was originally it was kind of thought by the Crown there might be 10 treaty settlements across the country. You'd have a South Island one, Ngāi Tahu, you'd have a Waikato one, Far North one, an Auckland one, a Bay of Plenty one, and of course that didn't take into account the genealogies and the complexities. And so, but the Crown, I think, and I think the Prime Minister basically said it out loud on Monday, at a sort of executive kind of level, at a political level, I think the Crown has always liked the idea of a single settlement because Northland really is, a site of sort of great deprivation, terrible social indicators up there, largely centred on Māori, and they really like the idea of an organisation and a political kind of grouping the size of Tainui or Ngāi Tahu that can become a real sort of serious economic actor up there and promote growth and regeneration and revitalisation. But that is not what, that's a Crown priority.
Sure.
And that's, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear over time that you can't shoehorn 130,000 people or 140,000 people into that aspiration, which is not even written down anywhere. That's not when you get to the level of the negotiators, that's not what they're sort of going for. They just have these sort of writing instructions that were sort of, from time immemorial. And I think it's meant that persisting with this sort of idea of a single settlement for longer than, the evolving treaty landscape is able to sustain it. And I think Finlayson said on RNZ the other day, Ngāti Hine are probably ready to settle now, because part of it is not just, what the Crown wants, etc., but it's which groups are ready to settle. So further north, what we call it sort of Te Hiku, or that was meant to be a collective settlement of 5 iwi, and one of them, Ngāti Kahu, has still not settled, and they won't settle while their lead negotiator Margaret Mutu is alive. Probably, they don't want to settle on the terms the Crown is willing to offer, and within Ngāpuhi there are there's probably similar sorts of
Factions.
Factions. Yeah, there's certainly some areas, like, Ngāti Hine, are much more ready to settle than others are. I think Annabelle's totally right as well, which is that the treaty settlement process, for all of its faults and all of its flaws, has been a huge bipartisan success story by the Crown. National and Labour, and not just that, New Zealand First, the Greens, ACT have all by and large supported the treaty settlement process. So I think the idea of putting these artificial constraints on the largest settlement by population through a members' bill, which would not even be introduced by Shane Jones because he's a member of the executive. So you would have to wait. Well, Tanya Jankovic is gone now.
Andy Foster.
Andy
Foster is going to solve the most intractable.
Bossy bear, leave it to him.
Yeah, here he comes.
Once the X-rays in restaurant bathrooms bill is passed, a slot will open up for New Zealand First backbenchers to introduce a proposed private members bill, and that's totally the wrong way.
Shane Jones has also said, Annabelle, that it is about putting it on the agenda for the election ahead. And isn't there an argument that
it's not an election issue? Settlements shouldn't be election issues, not like that.
But isn't there an argument that
settlements should be conducted by the superego of the Crown?
We're 30 years. We recently had 30-year anniversary of Tainui settlement. We're coming up to in a couple of years we'll have the same for Ngāi Tahu. And Ngāi Tahu now, your iwi, is an absolute economic powerhouse in the South Island. And so in terms of just the impetus to want Ngāpuhi to have that too, you can you understand? I mean, can we understand the wanting to kind of get things moving?
I can understand wanting to get things moving, but it's their settlement. Like they're not prepared to settle for anything less than what they're prepared to settle for. And trying to shoehorn them and bully them into a settlement that they don't want is not going to make for a lasting settlement that, allows them to move into the future the way they want to. Many Ngāpuhi people have said to me, look, we've waited nearly 150 years now, in 14 years' time or whatever, 5 years' time, for justice, and we'll wait for however long it takes. But I think, all of the focus seems to be on why don't Ngāpuhi hurry up and settle? It's like, well, why doesn't the Crown come to the table and do the things they need to do? Like, they'll settle, but you've just got to settle on agreed terms, not bullied into being a group of 200. Imagine trying to settle with everyone whose houses got ruined in Cyclone Gabriel as a group. It would just never happen. So why do you think that you can settle, with one body that represents 200,000 people? It's crazy.
And it used to be sort of common wisdom that you sort of had to wait for the older generation of Ngāpuhi leaders to kind of, lay down their swords and pass the baton. And then you would start to see sort of progress. There would be kind of a new generation that was more sort of, had seen how treaty settlements worked in, other areas and was sort of more sort of minded to get down to business. Now, I think there's been and less engaged in sort of personal enmities and sort of historical kind of grudges and things, with each other, I mean, not with the Crown, which is taken as read. But I think that, there is a danger for the Crown that if you wait too much longer, you get to the generation who see treaty settlements almost as a bit of a distraction and think that the really interesting thing is sort of constitutional reform and, really this is a question about sovereignty and we need to, that needs to be at the centre of this sort of thing, as opposed to the traditional elements of a treaty settlement. I think there is a risk of things, or even already, I think, being sort of, kind of going into this kind of cul-de-sac about the Waitangi Tribunal's report about sovereignty.
Ngāpuhi never ceded sovereignty, everyone.
Well, that's what the tribunal said. They didn't cede sovereignty when they signed the treaty, but the tribunal, of course, said, we are silent as to the subsequent passing of sovereignty, and there was a bit of publicity about this recently. Paul Goldsmith wants to revisit a clause in the initial agreement in principle, I think. Well, it was initial deed of settlement with Te Whānau Apanui, which is was described as a kind of agree to disagree clause about sovereignty. Te Whānau Apanui think that they have sovereignty in their rohe, the Crown thinks it has sovereignty, and I just sort of think those things are kind of a distraction. Those issues have been sort of adequately dealt with, or at least sort of sideboarded in previous settlements. You often talk about the nation of the iwi, and the political relationship with the Crown, but you don't get into the weeds of trying to define sovereignty, which I think still doesn't have an accepted definition in political science or philosophy, within the bounds of one settlement. There are all sorts of agreements most settlements recognise the tino rangatiratanga of, the iwi or the hapu, and then sort of park what that means until specific instances kind of come up. But I think that risks being a bit of a blind alley that these, they're not even at negotiations yet. It's been 15 years since I first thought. I was talking to somebody from Andrew Little's office in the Labour government, and I asked, how's it all going? And they said, we think we've had a bit of a breakthrough with Ngāpuhi, and I was like, I'll just let him be happy for today. I won't say anything. I'm like, great, that sounds excellent.
One little statistic that I registered in my brain recently that really shocked me in terms of, but because one of the comments that's been made about the Ngāpuhi settlement is what a waste of money and time and blah blah blah. New Zealand has given $150 million to the war in Ukraine, $150 million. And by comparison, Longbow I know, but bear with me, Tauranga Moana, the iwi of Tauranga Moana, who had 290,000 acres confiscated and then another 50,000 acres, they received 38 million. Lest we forget, Tauranga Moana were invaded by the Crown. So when we talk about money and settlements, I think we need to remember how much money the government spends on stuff that has no benefit at all to New Zealanders.
Well, I think the most important settlement we can all agree was $1.6 billion being paid out as a bailout for South Canterbury Finance.
Kia ora.
That's enough. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Annabelle. Thanks, Te here. Thanks for sticking it out with us today. And thanks especially to members of the spin-off.
We love you.
We love you.
We love you so much.
We love you a lot.
We will settle with you
Platonically.
every day. You can have all of the best settlements.
Yes.
The Spin-off Podcast Network.